Hello, viewers, and welcome back to Susty Talk. Yes, Edie's virtual video interview series, set up as a result of the lockdown issued in March 2020, is still continuing. Even as we start to exit out of lockdown, this is just the new normal, at least the current normal. It's how we communicate, and as such, Susty Talk continues. For those unaware, Susty Talk is Edie's ongoing series of video interviews put together to keep our audience of sustainability and energy professionals talking, feeling connected, and optimistic as we entered lockdown, exited lockdown, went back into lockdown, exit. I think this is technically exiting the third one now, hopefully the last. I'm Edie's content editor, Matt Mace, and joining me for this episode of Susty Talk, we have the aptly named Edie Lush. Edie is an award-winning journalist, an events MC, and a communication trainer. Edie hosts events virtually and around the world, from Davos to the COP climate summits. So what better person to talk to for Edie's, and that's us, Edie, own engagement week, a themed content on sustainability reporting and communications. Edie, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Good. Great to be with Edie.net. I have to say that I got an email from somebody the other day saying, I love Edie.net. You've really created something fantastic. And I wrote back and said, thank you so much. Yeah, I've worked really hard on it. I'm just kidding. I did not take credit for your guys' great work. You do have a fantastic name. So well done on that.
Yeah, named after our tea lady back in this is in the early 1990s now. So technically we're older than Google. But yeah, we get it a few times where people, they tag us on social media and they're just trying to talk to one of their friends. So it has its pros and cons. But Edie, thank you. You're joining us today, as I said, for Engagement Week. We've got a week of themed content all around how sustainability professionals can improve engagement, communication, strategy, and reporting. I suppose a good place to start then would be if you could explain how those kind of twin themes of communications, you're a communications expert, and the global climate action movement, how they both kind of intersected into your professional career.
So I think, like you, back in the day, I remember writing a blog about how the climate action network, the climate action folks had a communication problem. Back in the day, I think it was the fact that people couldn't get their heads around, why are you talking about global warming when it's so cold outside, right? There were a lot of scientific words. I think sometimes scientists aren't the best communicators. I don't think that that's true anymore. And I think the world has come on along a long way. I think that there are fantastic scientific communicators. I think that people exactly like Edie.net have been really part of that movement. What I think has happened for me that's been an incredible part of why I set up the Global Goals Cast, the podcast that I have, is that there are all these different kinds of communication about issues. We had the climate concerns. We had people talking generally about sustainability, people talking about diversity and inclusion, people talking about racial justice, people who were concerned about poverty, development issues. And actually, they've all slightly funneled together. And that's, I know we're going to talk about the global goals, but that is the point of the global goals, that they actually encompass all of these different conversations about sustainability, however you want to term them. And it's all in kind of one place. So for me, that's what's been so incredible about this conversation about communication and sustainability, is that these different threads are coming into one place.
And you mentioned threads, and I think that's really interesting because we kind of moved on from the days where climate change would be pictured through, you'd have a polar bear on an ice cap, you'd have messaging around turning your TV off standby, the kind of really simple message is just, and as it's becoming much more of a crisis and much more urgent to react, I think the messaging is actually becoming much more clear, and the awareness around it is certainly picking up. But do you think that communicating the complexity of climate change, you mentioned the global goals, SDG 13 climate action runs through every single one of them.
Mm.
It affects all of them, probably more so than vice versa, if I'm being honest in my own understanding of it. Do you think, though, that politicians, businesses, and the media, we're effectively communicating the climate crisis and what can and needs to be done in a way that doesn't kind of create fear and a bit of paranoia, but actually inspires action?
I think that is exactly the point, that we know that, I mean, in the newspaper world or the magazine world where I used to work, there was a phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. But we know that that doesn't inspire people to take action. We know that people don't take action from fear. What we do know they take action from is positive stories. And that is exactly what I think is now being done incredibly well in lots of different places. And that's what I try to do with the podcast, is tell the stories of the champions who are achieving the global goals. I think if I think about some of the folks that I've featured, for example, Annie Lennox, an incredible human being, a rock star. Her message is about global feminism. So she says that we can all stand for the rights of women and girls who come from less advantaged parts of our country and our world. People like Robert and Barney Swan, to take the climate issue, who walked to the South Pole relying solely on renewable energy. And their message was, if we can go to some of the harshest places in the planet just with renewable energy, we can all start to make some changes that will affect the future of our planet. I think that we know that people are inspired by, they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. That is good. We know that if you show a picture of, as you say, the polar bear on the melting iceberg, that actually gets less money donated than if you actually say, be a part of the change for the good. There's so many examples of that. And I truly believe that's why we started the podcast. We talk about the champions who are making the world a better place. And it's truly inspiring to find a network of people out there who are doing just that.
And see, I can have conversations with my friends who they're not in this sector. I can talk to them about climate change and they get it. I can talk to them about net zero and they start to lose the terminology a bit.
Yeah.
I can show them my water bottle with the SDG logo, my badge, which I'm foolishly not wearing.
Nice.
But I can show them that, and they don't know what the global goals means. And then I explain to them what they are, and it sounds like ending poverty, ending world hunger, essentially addressing every bit of conflict in the world right now seems a bit of an impossible task. But when you address it the way you have, that it's basically just inspiring individual actions that will make up millions of pieces to this jigsaw that fixes the world, it becomes a much more, I suppose, approachable conversation. The listeners to your podcast, did they come to it because it was the Global Goals Cast and they knew what that was, or did they come to it because they heard stories about these empowering individuals and the journeys they were on? Which one do you think is more effective? Is it leading with the framework or is it leading with the stories?
Oh my gosh, always stories, always stories. I mean, in my life as a communication trainer, I truly work with people on how they can speak with their experience. And that is the only thing that I think as human beings we understand. We've been telling stories since sitting around in caves, right? I mean, the problem with the global goals is that 17. I mean, why are there 17, right? There's like 240 different indicators. They all seem to be linked together in slightly different ways. Every country has to come to the UN every year and talk about how they're progressing on every single goal. I mean, that is not interesting, right? I mean, that truly isn't interesting. But what is incredible is, for example, a girl from Kakuma refugee camp that I was lucky enough to meet, who is learning how to code. And she is passionate about climate action. So she wants to grow up to become an environmental lawyer. And she says, I write my own destiny. I write my own story. I write my own code. So I hear her and I get chills, right? I mean, I think about some of the other folks like Brenda, who is crossed the Rio Grande in the United States, from Mexico to the United States, when she was 8 years old. She is still undocumented, but her talent for math was discovered at an early age, and she went to an incredible high school. She is now a software engineer at Google. She spent the last 4 years under the Trump administration wondering if she was going to be able to stay in the United States and work at Google. Now, Google didn't care. They said to her, "I'm going to send you to Dublin if you want. We can send you to Mexico." She said, "Actually, my business Spanish isn't good enough." So it wasn't Google that was going to not benefit. It wasn't really Brenda, although she didn't want to leave. It was really the United States who wasn't going to benefit by having, because we all know we need more women software engineers, right? So being able to tell a story like around migration, which is tricky. It has a lot of different aspects. But when you're able to get down to a human aspect, you actually really, you can do it, I think, in a way that it's much too difficult and complex of a story to tell in a tweet, right? Like, I don't even know how many characters are in a tweet now. 240? You can't, it's too complicated of an issue like that. I told another story, just to stay on migration for a moment, about a young man from Sierra Leone who had been, he was home from high school in Sierra Leone. He had been living with his aunt, going to high school. He went to his hometown. His father had died. He was out helping his mother sell some items on the street. She was a street market person. And a group of older men kidnapped him, and they wanted him to join the same secret society that his father had been a member of. He didn't want to do it. He knew that they were going to take knives and literally claw the back of his body to make these scars, to make him part of this. He ran away with nothing. So he managed to get away from this gang, left with literally the things he was wearing on his back. He became part of that story that we all know, of the throngs of people crossing the world, in this case from Africa to Europe. He was enslaved several times as a human slave. He got on one of those horrific rubber boats to cross the Mediterranean, having worked for next to nothing in order to get passage. He lost his best friend on that boat. He makes his way to a refugee camp in Italy and works again for next to nothing to get a smartphone. And that's when his life changes. So he's able to download Duolingo. He starts to learn Italian. He's able to download actually just Facebook, and through actually just a text messaging service developed by UNICEF Innovation, he's able to communicate with an immigration lawyer. He wins a poetry contest or poetry contest, and actually gets accepted into a high school in Italy. And he's just about to finish his IB, his International Baccalaureate. Now, that story tells you about education. It tells you about migration. It tells you about human slavery. It tells you about the importance of technology and the connections between technology and education, and partnerships, and incredible stories from the United Nations, as well as the private sector, right? These international lawyers giving their time. And all of those things, they're all part of the global goals, right? All of those issues are part of the global goals. It almost doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which global goal has which number, which color, which indicator. The whole point is that they are a framework. They're like the world's to-do list, because no one would disagree, right, with educating everyone. No one disagrees with making the world a place that our grandchildren will be able to live on. So that's what I think is so powerful about the goals, is the ability to address issues. It doesn't even matter if you don't know which goal goes to which number. And I personally still forget.
Yeah, it's I know that is the benefit of the color coded, isn't it? I can picture the colors in my head sometimes, not necessarily the numbers. So for our audience of sustainability professionals, then they're probably grappling with, we've got a big global framework, whether that's the SDGs, whether that's science-based targets, net zero commitments, biodiversity net gain approaches. And at the same time, they've got these human-centric stories that really resonate with their stuff. If I'm a sustainability professional and I'm sitting there being like, okay, I've got the framework, I've got some really nice stories across my value chain that I can tell, how do you then use them to inspire or create action? How do you take the narrative of the human-centric stories that you might have, or the ambitions of the global goals, and turn them into everyday actions that other people who, like you said, they happily agree with the destination, but they might be too preoccupied with their own concerns to necessarily agree on the journey? How do you create action?
Such a great question. So in the podcast, we always give people 3 facts that they can take away and look smart in front of their mother-in-law, and 3 actions that they can take. And actually, for the climate story that I mentioned earlier, where we followed Robert and Barney Swan to the South Pole, one of the actions we gave was that if you were inspired by this story, the Swans are leading a trip to the Arctic, and you can apply to go on it and learn about the climate, learn about climate action. And we found out purely through a Google News alert that a young man called Jason Hallmark had heard that podcast, and he'd heard the actions. And he had heard it while he was sitting, listening to the podcast on the edge of his hospital bed. He had just been diagnosed with MS. And his doctor came in and said, you may not have a lot of time to do hugely adventurous things. So you want to, sooner is better. And he was inspired right then to go home and apply to the Swans program. He went to the Arctic, and it changed his life. He learned an enormous amount about climate change. He came home, and I'm reading from him what he wrote here. He said, "I learned the skills to become a change leader and inspire others in Pittsburgh, where I live, to promote sustainability and environmental stewardship." And in fact, I was speaking to him on Facebook the other day, and he has started an NGO to help other people with disabilities to engage in the climate discussion. And so for me, that's an incredible story of how, when you do give people actions that they can take, it works. I mean, for me, it's incredible. When I think about the folks in my audience, they are not global goals experts. In fact, I've got pictures of them on my wall, because I always want to be speaking to real people. And when I think about them, I think about Katie, I think about Jason, I think about Oleg, I think about Annie, I think about people who care, but they aren't experts. And if I kind of bring that to a communications trainer language, I would say always speak to an intelligent teenager. So I have in mind, for example, my son, who's 18, who's intelligent, but he's not an expert in this stuff. But if I can explain it in a way that he understands, then anyone would understand it. And if you think about the really great speakers, the people who have gone down in history as being incredible orators, they speak to everyone at once. People like Steve Jobs when he launched the original iPhone. People like President Obama. They never use a word that somebody actually even a little bit younger would understand. I think Albert Einstein said that he spoke to the guy who took his garbage and the head of the university with the same words. And actually, it helps you come across as more of an expert. You don't need the jargon. All it does something to your face as well. Jargon. It makes it much harder to buy into you when I use jargony phrases. So for me, I love that idea of inspiring action. And I think the simpler you can make it. These are complex issues. You've got to take time to explain them. But if you can use language that everyone can understand, I think we bring more people along on the journey.
Now, that's some great advice there, and really interesting what you said about the speaking to someone different. And you mentioned teenagers, and some of the people I spoke to, yeah, they speak to their sons and daughters, many who have taken or took part, I should say, in climate strikes in 2019 when that was able to happen. And I suppose my final question is that certainly through the lens of corporate movements, we're slowly, at least, starting to move away from the white man's club. At least there is a bit more diversity happening through the lens of climate action and communications. How important is it that the diversity, and that's across all spectrums, is kind of championed to ensure that businesses get a real bird's eye holistic view of whatever strategy they're doing and the implications that has?
I mean, it's hugely important, right? I mean, if you look at diversity and inclusion from one perspective, I would say, we don't need to make the world any more diverse. It already is. Most of the world is not white, right? What we do have to focus on is this idea of inclusion, of bringing everyone to the table, which is why a lot of times so for the podcast, we're very pro women. So it's a female, a women-led podcast. My co-host and I are both women. She's Hispanic. We also feature a lot of women's voices, but we also really feature people who wouldn't normally be heard by our audience. So people who are at the end of the dirt road in Zambia, a market trader in Lusaka, and a woman who is growing legumes literally at the end of a dirt road. Students in Uganda who had a really hard time during lockdown. A frontline healthcare worker in Kenya who had COVID-19, and because of the impact of because the stigma around having COVID is so hard in Kenya, she didn't tell anyone for 2 months that she was ill. She was so ill. Her son, she's a single mother, she was educating her son at home. Her son had to leave school, go back a year. For me, it's so important for those voices to be heard, to be part of the conversation. I mean, for me, it's incredibly important. And you could put it a different way. In a business, it's important to think about being inclusive. If you look at your value chain, right, that all of your suppliers, are they all on board? There's this great term, the courageous collective, that Paul Pullman and Valerie Keller from Imagine talk about. It's this idea that you don't need a majority. You need about 30% of an industry to change, right? So you don't have to get everyone on board with this idea of global goals or inclusion or whatever you want to call it. But if you can get a large enough movement within whatever industry you are, you can force the boat to change direction. And I really love that, because it means that we don't have to convince everyone, right? It can be exhausting, and I know you know this too. But we do have to find those folks who are with us on the journey, and also lift their stories up. Much more fun that way too.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's what they're trying to do with this Race to Zero campaign, the build up to COP26, the breakthroughs. I think it's 20% of each sector angling towards a solution. So yeah, that's a great advice. Yeah. I think it's a losing battle if you're trying to convince everyone, but if you get a large portion of it on board, it's going to make a massive difference. Edie, thanks so much for your time today, and for being a great guest and providing some great insights. I think we've had a week of comms and strategy conversations, and I think the storytelling advice you've given is really a crucial piece of what is there's no blueprint to getting this right. There's multiple ways depending on the size of your organization. So your advice about adopting frameworks and human-centric stories, diversity, all of that's going to be a massive help to our audience. So thank you so much for that.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And to our audience as well, yep, Susty Talk is going to continue for the foreseeable future. We've got plenty lined up over the following weeks once Engage Week has finished as well. So in the meantime, stay safe, stay positive, and keep up the Susty Talk.